Good afternoon, good evening. I don't know if it's good morning for anyone still, but I welcome to our webinar today, where we're featuring authors on who have written wonderful books on Dorothy Day. My name is Kevin Ahern. I'm chair of the Guild for the Canonization of Dorothy Day and a professor at Manhattan University. These webinar series are sponsored jointly by the university and by the Guild, and we have some great conversations that we've had. When we do these webinar series, we've sort of developed a type of rhythm where we have some conversation among different people. The last one we did was on women, on International Women's Day and Dorothy's role on women. We have some also wonderful webinars featuring journalists and Dorothy's vocation as a journalist, and other sort of wonderful things that you can check out on our website. But we always like to give the first word to a student who would then introduce the speakers, and then we'll also give the student the first question. So after we do a few rounds of questions that I have already shared with the panelists ahead of time, we'll open it up to the floor, but we'll give our student the first round. So I'm excited to introduce Cozette Brown, who is studying great books at the University of Notre Dame. She's joining us today from Michigan. So Cozette, please take us off.
Of course. Hi, everyone. I am very pleased to present to you today our biographers and honored guests, Kate Hennessy, D.L. Mayfield, Blythe Randolph, and John Loughery for some conversation about their work writing the life and person of Dorothy Day. Kate Hennessy is a writer and artist and Dorothy Day's youngest grandchild. She is the author of Dorothy Day, The World Will Be Saved by Beauty, and co-author of Dorothy Day and the Catholic Worker, The Miracle of Our Continuance. She is also a contributor to the London Tablet, and she currently lives with her husband in Donegal, Ireland. D.L. Mayfield is a writer and podcaster and author of Unruly Saint, Dorothy Day's Radical Vision and Its Challenge for Our Times. Their current project is a newsletter and podcast called Strong Willed, dedicated to helping survivors of religious authoritarian parenting methods develop autonomy and find solidarity. Mayfield lives in Portland, Oregon, with their partner, two children, and two cats. Blythe Randolph is a native of Richmond, Virginia, and a graduate of Hollins College and the University of Virginia. She is the author of biographies of Amelia Earhart and Charles Lindbergh, and collaborated with John Loughery on their biography of Dorothy Day. She lives in Atlanta, Georgia, with her husband and three rescue dogs. John Loughery is the author of 8 books, including Alias SS Van Dyne, winner of an Edgar Award from the Mystery Writers of America, John Sloan, Painter and Rebel, a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Biography, and The Other Side of Silence, Men's Lives and Gay Identities, winner of a Lambda Award for Gay Male Studies, and most recently, An American at War, Surviving Bataan, Mukden, and the Trauma of Recovery, and Where the Pulse Lives, a memoir of growing up gay in the 20th century. A longtime resident of New York City, teacher and former art critic for the Hudson Review and book reviewer for the Washington Post, he now resides in Berlin, Connecticut.
Great. Thank you, Cosette. And thank you all. I was excited to hear the references to pets and in those biographies. So the first question, which should be an easy one, but sometimes it can be challenging for any author of a book, is could you just in your own words, right, give us a sense of what your book is about, right? There are lots of books that have been written about Dorothy, and these are an interesting set of new books that have come out. And can you tell us about a bit about your book and maybe what makes it distinctive than some of the other books that are out there? So we'll start with the order that Cosette led us off in. So maybe we can start with Kate.
I knew that was going to happen. um, I actually don't consider my book so much a biography as more of a memoir. Even though there's a lot of biographical elements to it, it really comes out of, it's called Dorothy Day, The World Will Be Saved by Beauty, an intimate portrait of my grandmother. And that isn't quite accurate. It's also an intimate portrait of my mother. And to me, the important story was the fact that my grandmother is a mother and a grandmother. I wanted to tell the story in from the family's point of view, because I realized that when my mother died, a whole history died with her. And I realized that if I didn't write the story from the point of view or as it affected my mother, a whole part of my grandmother's life would be lost.
Wonderful. So, DL?
Yeah, so I come from an evangelical background, and I found Dorothy Day when I was sort of grappling with the political and social implications of how I grew up and my faith. And when I discovered Dorothy Day, I just thought, oh my God, this is what I've been looking for. This is the marriage of these ideals that I have within me. And I just became very obsessed with her. And eventually I became really obsessed with a specific year, 1933, when she started the Catholic Worker newspaper. And I just thought, I wish more people my age and younger even kind of were able to put themselves in that year and see how important that was in American history, and also just maybe get introduced to Dorothy Day's writing, because she's such a fabulous writer and she has so much personality in her writing. And I just fell in love with those early issues of the Catholic Worker I could find. So I'm somebody who gets really obsessed with the topic, and I ended up writing a book about the starting of the Catholic Worker. But I don't claim to be a biographer or have like special insight or knowledge into Dorothy Day. Just it was actually such a good experience for me to immerse myself in her life and her writings. And then I kind of wanted to share that with people who might not even be familiar with Catholicism or that period in history. So that's kind of how my book came into being.
Great. And Bly and John, you're working on co-authoring a book, and maybe we can even talk about that at some point. But want to share a bit more about your book? Give a good overview of it.
John, what you want to start?
Sure. We definitely meant it to be as comprehensive a biography as possible, concerned with her religious evolution, but also her social and political life, her early life in Greenwich Village, because that's, to me, an amazing story, how someone who came from a family that was not only not religious, but anti-religious and very conservative and racist. And I mean, she's a perfect example of how we do need models in life, yes, but we also need anti-models. Her family was an anti-model. She didn't want to be like them. And the growth from that background, and then her very different bohemian times in Greenwich Village to what she became later, to me was endlessly fascinating. I mean, I don't think there is another American figure for whom the words, what you do unto the least of these, you do unto me, was put into practice in her life. And so I think Bly and I felt we wanted her to be better known as well, because it's been shocking to me how when she died in 1980, her obituary was on the front page of most national newspapers. I meet many people today, Catholics of all ages, and many Catholic priests who know very little about her beyond her name. And that's one good thing about the canonization process, that we need her to be known better out there. And I learned a great deal by her. And also, I want to say she also changed my life completely in a way no other person I wrote about did, and was completely unexpected. So thank you, Blythe, for bringing me on board, because I had no intention of writing about Dorothy Day. Blythe was working on this book, said, do you want to come on board with me? Fine. I grew up Catholic, wanted to be a priest when I was young, and then spent 55 years as a completely comfortable, confident atheist, not an agnostic, an atheist. Working on Dorothy Day changed my life completely, recovered a faith I had not even any thought that it would come back. And if she could do that for other people as well, I think that would be a marvelous thing. And if the book contributes in any small way, I'm happy.
And I would only add, John is absolutely right. She had been someone that I had been interested in for many years. But when I started telling people that I was researching her life in order to write a biography, I was amazed at how many people who I knew who read extensively, had no clue who this woman was. In fact, one of my favorite stories was the person in my book club who went around telling people that I was writing a book about the actress that did the Rock Hudson films, Doris Day, because she had no knowledge of Dorothy Day. And I was just so grateful that we were able to hopefully bring out something that would be appealing to people who didn't know about her.
That's great. I think one of the things that always moves me and motivates me in this work that I've been sucked into are all the people that have said reading and learning about Dorothy has changed who I am. And that's just, and it's what's fascinating to me is people of different generations, students of mine, people of older generations, different racial, ethnic, and economic statuses find this woman fascinating. And there's something there. And in a polarized context where we're so divided, there's something interesting that this woman is bringing people together. I'm going to depart from the script a little bit and ask some more specific questions, just following up on what you all were just sharing. Kate, you mentioned that you wanted to think about Dorothy's role as a mother, and a grandmother, especially in relation to your own mother. Do you want to just maybe comment on how your book does that, and what you want the reader to take away when you communicate that way?
Very interesting question, Kevin. Well, I think I have to speak first about how the book came to be, because it underlies everything. And when my grandmother died in 1980, my mother and I basically spent the rest of my mother's life, she died in 2008, talking about Dorothy Day. And it was interesting. It was interesting for both of us in that you could see her going through a series of understanding and things coming to light that were very difficult, and just kind of processing her relationship with her mother, and also in terms of myself, every decade seemed to bring a deeper understanding of her for me too. And while we were having these conversations, I said to my mother, you have to write the story. Because of course, my mother is the very first Catholic worker. She was 8 years old, I think, 7 or 8 years old when it started. And she grew up as a Catholic worker. And so I said, this is only a story that you can write. You knew these people, you knew everyone, you watched the worker develop into what it is now. And she said, oh, no, I can't write this story. And so I would let it go, and a few more years would pass, and I would bother her again with the question. And then, of course, in 2008, she died. And when she died, that was the moment I realized that if I did not take what I had learned from my mother, and also what I had learned from my grandmother, because I was 20 when she died, so I knew her quite well. If I didn't tell this story, all these stories, actually the original manuscript for my book was double the length, because the story of the Catholic worker, the story of Dorothy Day, the story of my mother, Tamar, is the story of many people at the Catholic worker. This is a community. And I wanted to, unfortunately, I had to cut out a lot of the juicy stories of the people that my mother grew up with and that I grew up with. And, the stories that we heard. My grandmother was a fabulous storyteller. So we just heard stories about Peter Moore and about all the early Catholic workers in a way that it felt like they were still alive. And I was just thinking, we can't lose this. We can't lose this. And so I was really, I had to write this book. And really, I knew I was the only person who could write it. That such an intimate portrait. It was really important for me to portray my grandmother as a human being, and with all the difficulties of being a mother and difficulties of being a grandmother, and all the twists and turns of our relationships, of our history, was so important. Because the last section of my book is called The Art of Human Contact, which is, of course, a phrase of Peter Moran's. And to me, this was the whole story, that this was about family, it was about community, it was about relationships. And that story wasn't being told.
one of the things that I find so moving about your book is, as a parent myself, it gives me some hope that in through all the mistakes that maybe some goodness can come. And there are so few canonized saints that have been parents. So I find comfort in that, dealing with a toddler, and I think several of us can relate to that. So yeah, hopefully we can get back to some of those things. DL, you mentioned the year 1933 as a focus. And I wonder why did you latch on to that? And how does that even connect to the notion of unruliness that you talk about? Can you maybe make some connections for those who haven't read your book?
Yeah, sure. Also, I want to say that Kate's book was so important to me when I was working on my own little book about Dorothy. I was parenting my own kids who were at that time 6 and 11. So it was really so helpful to think about Dorothy as a mom. And I don't know, that was like such a beautiful connection for me. But yeah, in 1933, Dorothy was like a mother in her 30s. And there was all of this writing she did and around that time period, because she talked a lot about the birth of the Catholic worker movement. But I was, obsessed with the paper. And so I just became very intrigued about what was going on politically around the world, what was going on in America. Like I said, I was raised evangelical. I was actually homeschooled. I had a very sheltered life and education. And similar to Dorothy Day, I just love to read. And so I kind of learned through reading. So I would read the books that Dorothy talked about during certain times in her life. And that also helped expand my worldview. But being as someone who lived in America, parenting kids, I was starting to get very worried about the rise of Christian authoritarianism happening around the world and in America. And I saw that reflected in Dorothy's writings, which I think is why I focused in so heavily around that time period. And I learned so much about American history that I frankly did not learn with my Christian homeschool history textbooks. So I kind of, okay, so people are putting in the chat some things that happened in 1933. And I honestly am like, I don't know too much about the specifics, but what I connected to was this feeling that there is this rise of authoritarianism coupled with religion that we need to be thinking about, we need to be talking about. And what Dorothy said was we have to prioritize the poor, we have to prioritize the working class. And we actually have this huge history in our religious tradition where this has always been said. And so I think for her, when she met Peter Morin, and by the way, becoming obsessed with Dorothy meant I got to meet Peter Morin and his easy essays and his writing. And that was so fabulous. Just like a totally different way and a very creative way of engaging with a lot of the issues that I and my neighbors on the outskirts of Portland, Oregon were experiencing, just issues of living in poverty, racism, xenophobia. It was all there, both in Peter's work and Dorothy's. And then to see her just come out of the gate with her first issue of the Catholic Worker, and to see her humor, to see her saying like, we're not going to make people who are Catholics feel great. We're actually going to be calling you out. We're going to be calling out the most powerful people in New York City, and we're going to be centering the stories of the working poor. And I just thought, these are things I want now, right? And these are things that my kids who are now entering teenage years, they want that now too. So I just thought there's something so fresh and alive about Dorothy trying to center working class people that I think honestly in 2026 America really, really resonates with people.
That's great. Thank you. I will get back to the question of unruliness a little later, I think. Blythe and John, I'm curious what it was like to write about Dorothy, who had such an attention to community, but to do it together, to co-author something. It's not something I've had the privilege or maybe challenge of doing, co-authoring a book. So I wonder, but I've co-edited books with people, and I know that can be challenging. So I wonder what you want. Is there anything from the experience of co-authoring that connected to Dorothy, or the way Dorothy connected to that experience?
It was hell. Every minute was hell. No, it was pretty seamless. I would say, and this is overly simplistic because obviously both of us wrote everything, but I would say that when Dorothy got on the Greyhound bus and went to protest somewhere, that that was sort of me. But John told you what she was reading when she was on that bus. What I am a titular Episcopalian, but I am not. I have to say I am not the most devout person in the world, and I'm one of those obnoxious people that frequently has more questions than answers when it comes to theology. It was so helpful that John, who eats philosophy and religion for breakfast, came on to this project, and it's a much, much deeper book because of his involvement.
And I did have to overlook Blythe's Protestantism and go back to my Catholic youth to understand her. I do want to say one thing though about DL bringing up Peter Morin, that we should give a shout out to Mark Ellis's biography of Peter Morin, which I found a very stimulating and interesting book. I think all of us who worked on Dorothy Day found the encounter with Peter Morin completely unsettling and wondrous in so many ways. The other thing I want to say is New York publishers love books about progressive people, especially women who are in some way or other progressive. But the thing that appealed to me so much about Dorothy was that she's a complete paradox in that regard. In fact, we titled the introduction of the book "An American Paradox." So you've got someone who is an Orthodox Catholic eventually, and seen as conservative by some in the women's movement and elsewhere, being totally horrified by Roe v. Wade, et cetera, and yet also at the same time, the most progressive, the most socially conscious person imaginable, the most devoted advocate for the homeless, the most determined pacifist. But it's mixed with so many other qualities. That's what I found absolutely fascinating about. And I was also pleased that our book could also delve into the gay and lesbian presence at the Catholic Workers, which I don't think had been addressed otherwise. From the 30s, many of the young people who worked there were gay and lesbian. And then to follow Dorothy, the evolution of Dorothy's thinking about homosexuality was, to me, as a gay man, but I think to anybody, it was absolutely fascinating. Her life in Greenwich Village among so many gay people, the workers, then a more conservative view as in the 40s and 50s, and then confronting ambiguities in the 70s that were really quite remarkable and interesting. I think she's in some ways a more interesting figure than a true blue progressive liberal woman activist in a way.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned Peter and others mentioned Peter. And of course, we're only a few days away off from the anniversary of Peter Morin's death on May 15th, 1949, if I'm not mistaken. And yeah, it's a wonderful thing that Dorothy always tries to point direction at Peter when talking about the founding story. A type of humility, but also I think a real respect for that. Yeah, mysterious, mystical experience of this guy showing up at our door. So I wonder, when as a theologian, as a scholar, as a teacher, when I start my own writing projects, I often have one idea in mind of what I'm going to study, what I'm going to ask, what I'm going to find out. But the coolest things happen when I start doing that research and I'm like, whoa, I didn't know this, or I found something else. So maybe we'll go reverse order and start, John and Blythe. Is there something that you found in writing the more critical biographical book, right, the comprehensive project, that you didn't expect when you began the research? What did you find that was like, wow, or that's really cool, or that's really neat, or no, that's maybe it doesn't have to be positive, right? Is there something? Oh,
Well,
and John's getting a book. I think that's a good sign for a writer. Yeah, Blythe, why don't you start?
well, I always think that one of the great stories about Dorothy was when in the early days of the Worker, um, there was this neighborhood woman who would come and bring food or clothing or or money to help out, and she just worshipped Dorothy. And one day they passed in the hallway, and Miss Mary Lane said to her, "Oh, Miss Day, do you have visions?" And Dorothy was still smoking at that point, and she pulled a cigarette out of her mouth and said, "Hell no. The only visions I have are of unpaid bills." And I just loved that. I just thought that now that's a person who's really trying to do the work and facing all the frustrations that came with doing the work. And I just that was for me, that was just one of those seminal moments that I just thought, this is the woman I could follow.
For me, the book that I went to get is called It Had to Be Revolution, Memoirs of an American Radical by Charles Shipman. And he knew Dorothy around the time of the First World War. And for me, it was interesting because I'm very interested in American social history. And I had written a book about a painter, John Sloan, who lived in Greenwich Village and was a political radical and an early modern painter, was where she came from, the distance she came from to become the person she was later. Because I think that the libidinous life of Greenwich Village, the people she knew, the interesting people, but the drug taking, the whole thing. This was really, Shipman really loved her dearly, but he's quite blunt about exactly how far from being a religious person she was when he knew her. I mean, she was 19, 20, 21 years old. That in so many ways, this was a very exploratory soul at that age. And where she was going was not in the direction she would go. She would never have believed that she would be the founder of the Catholic Worker Movement 20 years later. And that she was in many ways a lost soul at 19, 20, 21. Her family had been no help. And now the Bohemian Circle in Greenwich Village was no help in that regard. Yet something was calling her. And that fascinated me. I mean, I think in general, we're a lost country that way. In the time of Trump, we are completely morally lost. But the idea that one could be morally lost and find one's way to something else has to give us some measure of hope, because her late childhood, early adolescence, or early adulthood were a very interesting but difficult time.
So for both of you, just following up, were there any little aspects or any stories, just any other stories that you had not expected to find, or that challenged you or reaffirmed the questions you went into the project with?
For me, most of my books are about people long dead, so I never interviewed people who knew her in any large number. A bit with John Sloan, the painter who died in 1951. But with somebody who died in 1980, the opportunity to meet all these people who knew her in the 70s, some of them became good friends, and to hear their stories, yes, too many to name, but they were quite revelatory. All that she had to put up with in some way in this circumstance. That was very interesting to me and very moving. There were a few very interesting interviews I had sitting in her bedroom at Mary House, and conducting the interview there with some people who knew her well and shared the most intimate memories of how supportive she was. Including a woman who came to work at the Catholic Worker and said, "You have to know I had an abortion when I was young and it torments me." And Dorothy saying to her, "That has nothing, no, come be a part of us." And intensely emotional scenes and interviews like that meant an enormous amount to me.
Blythe, following up?
Just that there were so many things I found surprising. When Stanley Vanushki said at the end of the day, she's just a cranky old lady. Again, that how human is that? Because the life she was living was very uncomfortable in so many ways. And I think about her personality and how little privacy she had, and how difficult it was to raise her child in that environment. And I just found her incredibly human, and with all of the challenges that humans have to face.
And can I just say also, it seems to me most people I know who go to church, who claim to be religious, are seeking comfort in church. And Dorothy was about what Jesus had preached was not comfort, was challenge, was disruption, was difficulty. And I think that's lost in 99% of religious experience in modern America. People want to be comforted and they do not want to be challenged to the extent that Jesus and Dorothy Day expected them to be challenged.
Afflicting the comfortable and comforting the afflicted, whatever that phrase is, right? But so
Yeah.
you're both pointing to the humanness of her and her. A lot of people talk about the humanness of her spirituality, the incarnational theology or spirituality that she brings, sort of by almost by instinct, and the writers that she's drawn to. So we can come back to some of that. DL, this notion of unruliness, right? So did you have that title when you in your book proposal before you started writing, or did that come about after you started writing? Right? I think sometimes it's a chicken and egg sort of thing when we're doing a writing process of where you begin. But I'm wondering, did that emerge before, and was anything confirmed, or what did you discover as you were doing the research in relation to unruly? And maybe you can define a bit of.
I think for me, I just knew Dorothy was a very complex puzzle that my brain liked to think about. And I think her anarchism is so interesting in how it relates to her religious faith and being devoted to the Catholic Church. And as a Protestant, as an evangelical, I just tried so hard to make it all work and all match up. But it seems like she kind of confused most people with some of these values she had and then her commitment to her faith. And I think that helped me more than anything to realize she was actually quite hard, I think, for people to put into a specific box. And, maybe she enjoyed that. I'm not sure. But I just, as somebody who's not a Catholic, my mom was raised Catholic, but converted to evangelicalism. So I had only heard some quite negative things about the Catholic Church. It was fascinating for me to come in as an outsider and to see how huge of a role the church played in her life. And yet, especially in her early years, just this suspicion of authority, right? And this refusal to accept just because this is the way it is, this is the way it has to be. And she was always advocating for change. And also, she had so many interesting conversations with so many different thinkers. And that was something I just really wanted in my own life, just to broaden my own appeal and not to be afraid of people who had the term socialist or even communist or anarchist, because I had been raised to fear those terms and to fear people who had views that maybe would fit into there. So I viewed her as unruly. I actually emailed Kate and asked her if she had a picture of Dorothy Day smoking. And Kate sent me a picture with Dorothy Day, smoking a cigarette while actually wearing a medallion of the Pope. And I just thought, that is so amazing. What a way to just make people think a little bit harder about maybe some preconceived ideas they have about either the Catholic faith, or I would say this leading towards listening to those who have been most marginalized by the power structures in place. So I think I was very surprised by the amount of sort of anarchist leftist thought Dorothy immersed herself in, especially in her early years, and how I think those threads kept showing up throughout her life in her writing.
Is there anything specific that comes to mind? Any more specific element of that you wrote about?
I mean, this is so hard because I just feel like I'm such a emotional person, and I was just connecting to her as someone who said, I want to follow these teachings of Jesus Christ, which is actually making my life so difficult because the structures in place that proclaim to love Jesus Christ are making it harder for me to do that. So I really connected as someone who desperately wanted to follow these principles of Jesus, but kept coming into conflict with the Christians in my life. So for her book, even The Long Loneliness, her writing that meant so much to me, because sometimes it can be so lonely to be a person of faith with these values. And Dorothy just really helped me in that way, but it wasn't in a safe, comfortable way. It was very unruly. I think it's very hard to read any of Dorothy Day's writing and come away feeling like, well, I'm just going to have a normal day. I feel like it asks some response. It asks you to think about your life in for me in the United States, is it matching up to these values I have? And oftentimes it made me think, I don't think I actually am living up to those ideals. So that's what I'll say about that.
That's something a lot of my students, when we teach about Dorothy, make the same almost frustrated appeal to say, why did you make me read this? Because now I'm having to think, or now I'm having to, and Cozette, you're sort of smiling. I'll just bring you in here on that quickly. Does that something that resonates with you?
Yes, not to be dramatic, but the first thing I ever read from Dorothy was The Long Loneliness, and it just like struck like a hammer. Like it was nothing short of a revelation. I had never seen Catholicism lived out that way. And again, like I really agree with DL. Dorothy challenged all of my preconceptions of what a saint or a saintly figure is and looks like and does and says. And so I was just it absolutely transformed my relationship with faith and religion and what it means to try to live out the gospel.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah, the word we're hearing the interesting words about the human element, and theologically we could say incarnational. We're hearing elements of the disruption, which and the challenging, and the word disruption is in vogue these days. There's lots of talk about disruption and in higher ed or disruption in society, and maybe Dorothy was doing that in a way. There's a question of also hearing that you're saying is pointing to an integrity, a very unique integrity that practicing what you preach can be challenging. I'm hearing some of that. But so that's always these discoveries we find when writing can be when they become projects of love, which it sounds like if you're still willing to talk about the book after you're published you must still love the topic. But I wonder, Kate, you began this project maybe not in the same traditional research method as a researcher, but did you discover anything about your grandmother or your mother's relationship with your grandmother that you didn't quite expect to find?
Well, first, before I answer that, I just want to quote my mother. I'm hearing, people say that Dorothy was a paradox. She was complicated. And my mother said, Dorothy is full of contradictions. You just have to get over it. As for learning something that unexpected, well, first of all, I thought I knew a lot. I had grown up with stories. I had grown up knowing my grandmother and my mother. And so I thought I knew where this was all going. And what happened was I knew very little. I was very lucky in that there are a lot of writers in my family. There's a lot of diaries written. There's a lot of information in archives, in my family's possessions. And so I was able to really dive deep into their lives. My mother actually for a while kept a diary. She actually kept one around my grandmother's death that year. Very powerful time for my mother. My father was a diarist. And, I would have to say there are two things that spring to mind. Well, three things of what I didn't expect. One was I didn't really know these people. I thought I knew them. I thought I knew my grandparents. I thought I knew my parents. I didn't. I knew them as my parents, my grandparents, but I didn't know them as who they were as individuals and how they related to each other. So that was a big surprise for me, that how little I knew, how little I understood my own family. The second thing that I did not know was that I discovered that my father's very first love was a man. And that made so much sense to me, and it made so much sense to my siblings, because my father was a tormented man, and all we knew was his torment and his alcoholism. And for me to realize that he thought he was going to hell because of his love for another man, And he spent the rest of his life thinking that. That was utterly devastating for me to find out. And the third thing that I did not expect to find is how much I fell in love with all of them. Not only understanding my father for the first time in my life, but understanding my mother and understanding their relationship, my parents' relationship, understanding my grandparents' relationship. And I just fell in love with them all. And I certainly did not expect that.
And Kate, thank you. And when you wrote this wonderful memoir, you had already experienced your own life, your own career, your own development. And did that make a difference approaching it at that particular moment in your life versus if you were writing it, let's say in 85 or 95?
Absolutely. I couldn't have written it any sooner than I did. And it took me 7 years to write that book. It was no easy task. And I wrote it in the wake of my mother's death. So, truthfully speaking, not to sound melodramatic, but it is the truth. I spent the first 2 years writing that book crying. I mean, it was so difficult. I'm going to start crying right now. It was incredibly emotionally powerful. And I could not have done it before then for two reasons. One, I just wasn't mature enough. I didn't have the capability to really just accept these people. Family ties are so complicated. Not only do we think we know each other, but we make assumptions. We never change our opinion. I'm still the youngest child. I never get a chance to grow up in my siblings' view. It's not really true, but sometimes you feel that your family never kind of sees you change. And I've totally forgotten my point that I wanted to give. Sorry. My grandmother would do that too. She'd go totally off point, but she was a better storyteller than I am. What was Kevin? Bring me back.
Just the time in your life when you wrote the book that you couldn't have written it in 1995, that you had to write it
Yeah, I wasn't mature enough. I didn't. Well, truthfully speaking, I hadn't lived enough. In order to understand other people's suffering, you have to have suffered yourself. That's
As you were in that vein, is there any memory that you have of Dorothy that took on a new meaning for you?
Took on a new meaning. That's an interesting question. I think it's. I mean, I have many memories of her, and some of them were absolutely seminal. Like when I discovered that she was a writer. I was like 7 years old. Absolutely blew my mind that anyone could be a writer, because I loved writing. I loved stories from the very beginning. And so that moment that I ran into her bedroom and she was sitting at her typewriter and I was, a little girl. So I was like yelling, and my mother said, shh, shh, Granny's writing. That was really a powerful moment. And it really kind of, it was my touchstone, of me wanting to become a writer and me developing as a writer. But truthfully speaking, the power that I have felt from my grandmother and from my growing understanding of her is a very not complicated, it's a complex. It's like when people view her conversion as, her conversion was one moment when she joined the Catholic Church. And I see her. There's one thing that I learned when I was researching her life, is that it's this entire arc of growth and change, and I realized that how often people just cherry pick moments of who she was at a certain point without seeing this whole arc. And I'd say that also mirrors I'm still learning who she is, as I'm growing older. Each decade is, bringing a different element, a different understanding of not only my relationship with her, but also what she is asking of me. Not as her granddaughter, but as a person paying attention to what she is saying and what she is doing, what she did. That is a constant question that is before me pretty much every single day of my life.
That's great. One of the challenges, I think, in talking about heroic people, whether they be people in our society or saints or others, is that many of us, our pedagogical experience with biographies tend to be when you're in third, fourth, fifth, sixth grade. So you have all these, I encounter this with students, I encounter this in parishes, people whose faith formation stopped when they were children, for example, or whose education with history stopped when they graduated high school. So they were presented with pedagogically appropriate books about someone when they were 17 or 14, but the complexities of the human story, right? Or, St. Francis is way more than just birds on a bird feeder, right? Sitting on your shoulders. And so I think we often sanitize or domesticate the stories if we just remain at the level of a third grade religious education book or a history book or a biography. So I think what you're pointing to, what I'm hearing, which is very important about what you have all done, is pointing to the complexities in an adult approach to a saint or to a historic important person, an interesting and paradoxical American, showing those complexities. So I think that's an important point that I think we're all learning, because we're all complicated people and we're all growing, as you were suggesting, Kate. Kate, you helped to transition well into this next question, and then we'll open it up to more interactive conversations about the role of the writer. So we had a webinar a couple of months ago or years ago now, I guess, about Dorothy and the vocation of the journalist. But Dorothy was more than just a journalist; she was also a writer. So how did working on this book inform your sense of being a writer?
Well,
Are you asking?
43 years of teaching. I've taught everything from fifth grade through college sophomores. And I'm completely and always was opposed to any sanitizing, any limited approach to teaching anybody anything. So I love the fact that I could get into the parts that I think even Dorothy wanted sanitized in a way. I mean, I don't think, for instance, she wanted the young people in the 60s at the Catholic Worker to know all the details of her life in Greenwich Village and the marijuana, et cetera. They didn't need to know that, she felt. So she was, as we all do, editing her own life story to other people. And I love the aspect of a biographer where you don't have to edit. You don't have to pay attention to the subject's wishes about how to be portrayed. And what you come up with is what you think is a more authentic and real and unsanitized version of the person. Of course, what you're really writing is not the version of the person. That's impossible. You're writing your version of this person. Your own subjectivity is in play there. But she just gave so much material, and then meeting people who knew her and interviewing those people, she just gave you so much material for not producing a plain, sanitized, one-dimensional biography. That's ridiculous and doesn't even seem possible with Dorothy Day.
So, but John, did doing this project about someone who's a writer change the way you even thought about your own role as a writer? Or is there any way in which you might have been informing that or approaching her in writing in a different way as you were doing this?
No, I can't say that it did. The change for me, her impact for me was religious, was theological, was spiritual, and that was life altering. So I wouldn't say it affected my view of her. There are similarities between my biography of John Sloan, the painter and socialist, and my biography of her, but John Sloan had no effect on my spiritual life. And the biography I wrote that preceded the Dorothy Day with Blythe was about John Hughes, the Archbishop of New York, who founded St. Patrick's and Fordham, where I went to school, and fought the Protestant nativists and so on, and would never in a million years convert anyone or bring anyone back to the faith. That very difficult, combative man. So for me, it was all the other part of Dorothy that had such an effect, and that was plenty right there.
And as John, you were suggesting, there's the new mural at St. Patrick's Cathedral that features Dorothy and John, so-called Dagger John, right?
That's right. I forgot. Yes, that's right. He's right next to her there. They would not have gotten along at all. He would have said, "Woman, know your place. We cardinals, we bishops, we're the ones who will tell you what to believe and think and do." And she would have said, "Oh, really?" So I think that, yeah, the mural is suggests a little bit of the institutional view of Dorothy, and there's a disconnect there in a way. Nor should she be positioned by Al Smith behind her, conservative rich man by the time of the Depression. She's not totally in congenial company in that beautifully done mural.
Yeah. Blythe, do you have any thoughts on the writer element?
Well, one thing that I do want to tag on to something John said, which is that, Dorothy was so ashamed about aspects of her early life. But one of the things that I really felt strongly was that so many of the elements of her wild years in the village actually put her on a particular path. I don't think I mean, in one sense, of course, it seems like two different people, but I think that was part of her search. And so I've always been, as a result, I've just been very grateful that she had those wild years and hung out with Eugene O'Neill, and that I did, and interviewed Trotsky. I just thought that really helped ultimately form the person that she became.
And that, I think, is a more appropriate understanding of the notion of conversion in terms of pilgrimage. That it's not often this dramatic moment of falling off of a horse, which isn't actually part of the biblical tradition about St. Paul, but it's a continual process of unfolding, right? There are moments that grow, and that's how Dorothy describes it herself in her own work. So that's a really great point. DL, any thoughts on, as someone who approached this maybe as one of your first book projects, right? Do you have any thoughts on that, on the writer element?
Well, I think, like I said, Dorothy is just an incredible writer. So I think she's so interesting to study. Her journalism in the Catholic Worker is very fascinating. I love her like personal slice of life writing. I like how she can do that. She was very focused on hyperlocal, and then also her city, and then also the nation, and also global politics. But I think even like today, I also find her diary entries fascinating as well. So I think she's a great example of being a writer who does all these different kinds of things. And I know for myself, I can get locked into, as a freelance writer, like I need to write something that will change policy or change people's hearts and minds. But the importance of like diary writing in tumultuous times, I don't think can be overrated. I think all of us can diary, and we can journal, and we can take note of what we're living through and how we're processing that. And Dorothy did that too. It was very fun for me just to read her published books, read her Catholic Worker, and then read her diary entries and try and be like, they're all a little different from each other. And I don't know, it kind of encouraged me to do a few different kinds of writing.
As part of the canonization process, we had to compile and send to Rome all of her writing, published and unpublished writing that we could find, including marginalia and books, also her diaries transcribed. We also found and tracked down her gardening column that she wrote in one of the Staten Island newspapers, and that's one of my students helped to find these gardening columns. So there are wonderful stories about Mrs. Brown's petunias flowering as part of these process, alongside her FBI file and other things. Mm-hmm. So again, the paradox of a person. All of your books were also sent off through that process as well. So that's just so you have that sense. Kate, before and we're going to open it up to Cozette in a second to ask a question or two, and then we'll open it up to the participants to chime in and ask. But Kate, any more thoughts on this notion of writer? So if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, or we'll find a way to get them in there. So Casey will help to our wonderful staff person will help to get that going. But Kate, any more thoughts on this notion of writer? As you identified, you come from a family of writers, and that is a beautiful vocation. But this notion of Dorothy as a writer.
Well, it was, I love her writing, and I've always loved her writing. And so I have always been quite intimidated by the fact that I want to be a writer also. I would say I'm grateful for DL for mentioning her diary writing. When I was quite young, my grandmother told me to start a diary, and I listened to her. And I have kept a diary since I was 13 years old. I still do it every day. And it's my lifeline. And I'm so grateful for her for her to say to me, write a diary, keep a diary. She was very, very firm on that. I think in terms of overcoming my fear of writing because of how good she was, it's like you have to get over it and you have to do it. And writing that book taught me how to be a writer. I mean, I had written a lot before that, but writing that book really taught me how to be super careful of how you write. I was writing about people who were dead and couldn't respond to anything I said. If I was wrong, they couldn't correct me. It really took the amount of responsibility to write the responsibilities in writing really came home to me in writing that book.
Can I say one thing about her writing
Please.
that did impress me, and so much because I'm not good at it, how very pointed and direct she could be, and yet had such a word sense that she could do that without being belligerent or combative. I think, for instance, when Cardinal Spellman went to Vietnam and he urged the troops on to victory, kill the communists, and Pope Paul is saying negotiated settlement, and Spellman is saying no, more gunpowder. And she writes about that when he comes back. And all she says is, we have to remember that words can be as damaging, as destructive as napalm. That is telling Cardinal Spellman, you were wrong to go and talk that way to the troops. And she's a pacifist. It said it perfectly without crossing a line. They had a very dicey relationship, Spellman and Dorothy Day, and she just knew how to use words in those awkward situations.
You can also think about the masterful way she responded to the bombing of Hiroshima, and the playing with the name of President Truman, of talking about the bombing and as sort of almost an antichrist figure being carved out in a cave and bearing fruit or being tried in the desert, right? Sort of paralleling that, and then returning back to the immediacy of the needs of the people in the house that she was serving. I think the Pigsy, the guy from Secaucus, and this amazing ability to play with words is just mesmerizing to me. Kate mentioning keeping a diary, that could be a good thing of advice that we can give to young people, especially where AI is at work here. But Blythe, you wanted to chime in on something here?
Oh, no,
Yeah,
I'm
good.
sorry.
Yeah, so the idea of keeping a diary, I think, is an interesting one. Maybe those of us working with young people might encourage, or those of us ourselves who don't do that might take that lesson as a tool. So I appreciate that, Kate. Cozette, what do you come out with hearing and listening to this as you study great books? And here we have some authors of some books here. What are you coming at here? What's some questions or response that you're thinking of?
Yeah, of course. So whenever I'm reading a book, I'm always interested in the author's perspective and the process of writing. And so I guess I was wondering, we've mentioned a lot about complexity and paradox in a person like Dorothy Day. And so I can imagine that for anyone attempting to write a biography about someone like her, one of the joys and challenges, maybe, is trying to take all the pieces of her life and fit them together into a cohesive narrative, something that you can give to other people. And so, not to put you on the spot, but I was wondering if there was any dimension of Dorothy that you found difficult to work into your final product, or had a hard time just processing personally, that or that you found particularly rewarding to figure out while you were working on your respective books?
She knew so many different people and different kinds of people, and how she managed to live with them and work with them. And even the ones I've met who I'm just amazed at her openness to humanity in all its variety. That was really, everybody seems to everybody else to have one strong dimension to their character and work and personality. And the fact that this wasn't true at all. I mean, one reason people don't like biography is they think it's a collection of facts. They think it's just you're gathering this information and you're writing some doorstop of a book about that, when in reality it should be thought of as portraiture. The great scholar Leanne Dell said we should be looking for the figure in the carpet, and the figure in the carpet for her is just so hard to attain, and that's a marvelous thing, that she can't be rendered sanitized or pat.
Please, people, others chime in.
Otherwise, I'll keep talking. I find it hard, a woman who had to give up so much in terms of her love of intimacy, her love of relationships, her love of love, her love of sex, that she had to give all of that up in a way. And learning about Ahern Hennessy and that whole relationship, and with with Tamer's father, that was all to me, very difficult to sort through and get a sense of this woman.
Kate, there was actually a question in the chat about your grandfather, and maybe I don't know if you had a chance to see it, but the writer Anne says, I have read and loved loved Kate's book, but not read the others. I will read them. I remembered being curious about Tamar's father and Dorothy's grief about the ending of that relationship. Did Tamar continue to have a connection with her father through her life, or did you or your siblings have a connection with him?
Yes, and actually my grandparents kept in contact also, because of course they shared a child. And so it always sounds like in the long loneliness that it just stopped, relationship stopped. Mm-hmm. But of course they were in contact, particularly in the last years of their lives. They talked to each other every day. My mother, it was hard. When we moved, my mother moved up to Vermont. It was harder to keep in contact with her father, but she did. And he never came up to visit us, but we would go down to visit him. It wasn't a frequent visit, but he lived in Greenwich Village, so it was easy. When my mother would go down to New York to visit my grandmother in the last 5 years of my grandmother's life, she would then go over to visit with Foster.
And of course, Dorothy had Foster's phone number written on her desk that you can still see in Dorothy's room. That little pull-out shelf that desks used to have, that you could rest the shelf there, that would come out of a drawer, and where a lot of people write their phone numbers or put Post-it notes. That Dorothy had Foster's number there, and on the wall there are images framed and given to Dorothy by Foster. So there's beautiful relationships that evolve and are complex, right? Which is part of that story. I wonder, we have a question in the chat here that from Emily. Each of you spent years with Dorothy as you wrote and researched with these books. As biographers, what was it like immersing yourself in her life while going about and living your own lives?
Well, your own life becomes very secondary. You immerse yourself. I think all biographers choose people for whom they have a kinship. And if one's life had gone in a different direction, you'd be like that person. So that fuels that whole thing. Now, of course, that theory breaks down if you're writing about Attila the Hun or Hitler. But I'd say even there, the biographer has an obsession with power and how one gets it. So yeah, I feel like you live the life to what extent you can of the person you're writing about, and your own life becomes not as central for a while.
I
DL,
agree.
do you feel that way, DL?
I was gonna say I don't agree, but that's because I wrote this book during the first year of COVID, and I had a kindergartner and a fifth grader at home, and so I was trying to balance reading through all these different books, looking at the archives of the original Catholic workers, while society was being tested, and I was also in interpersonal conflicts with my own religion. So for me, I had been trying to live like Dorothy Day for about 10 years at that point as an activist, as somebody who lived in voluntary poverty with refugee and immigrant communities. So it was such a fascinating time for me. And I just think it really saved my sanity during some really, really hard times to be able to immerse myself in Dorothy's life while also making connections to how I wanted to live my life now. I even think, it's 5, 6 years later, and I'm still, some of those things I really had to wrestle through, they're impacting my life now. And I feel much even more secure about who I am, what my values are, how I'm going to work to see that in the world. Thanks to getting to spend so much time with Dorothy Day and her writing.
Even your own reading changes. I mean, my wanting to read everything I knew Dorothy read, and not just the religious writers, but all of the creative writers from Dostoevsky to Aldous Huxley. My reading was Dorothy's reading for a good part of 2 years, not my own reading or whatever else I'd want to read.
Others.
Well, I was going to say, my response to your question, Kevin, was, what life? I was absolutely immersed. Absolutely immersed. Though I did have to take time off. There was one period in which I had to completely back off for about 3 or 4 months and not go near it. I really had to pull back. But other than that, it was full immersion. My poor husband, had no idea what I was up to. And what more is there to say? How can, as John says, as all of you are saying, there is so much richness. There is so many stories. There's so many rabbit holes to go down. There are so many characters. There's so many facets of my grandmother, and so many things that she went. I mean, she had an extraordinary level of energy, and she had an extraordinary level of curiosity. And that's one reason why she was so successful with the Catholic worker, is that she was curious about everyone who walked through that door. Mm-hmm. She wanted to hear their stories. She always wanted to hear what people were doing, wanted to find out who they were, what they were doing. And she could speak to anyone. Anyone would tell her their stories. And as if anyone has worked on the soup line or been in one of the houses of hospitality, you don't ask people their stories. There's a certain level of respect that you don't pry. Well, Dorothy didn't have that, but no one minded, because she was true curiosity, true caring. And I think that just being brought into that heightened way of understanding each other and understanding the world, understanding the importance of our actions, understanding personal responsibility on very small levels and on very large levels is it's incredibly heady. I mean, it really it takes you over. And I have to kind of laugh at, I not laugh, but I understand completely, John, when you say that she changed you. I keep meeting people to this day that say things like, I met your grandmother for 10 minutes 53 years ago, and I haven't been the same since. You cannot come away from any encounter with her, if you're paying attention, without being so thoroughly changed and so thoroughly overtaken by her. There's plenty of ways to not be overtaken by her, but that's when you kind of set her aside, you admire her, you say, oh, she's a saint, or she's, a communist. There's many ways to kind of push Dorothy aside. But if you don't push her aside, if you welcome her into your life, you will be changed.
I found a sense of place was important too. It was important to me to live in New York when I was doing this work, so I could go spend time down at the two separate Catholic worker homes, and to go to find any building she might have seen, like to weasel my way into the Mott Street place where they were for a while and talk my way in to see, because it's still there in the dump that it is, and to get the whole sense of it, or to spend time in St. Joseph's Church on 6th Avenue, where she would go even in her Greenwich Village bohemian days to watch people saying the rosary, to go there and pretend I'm her in 1920 and don't even know why I'm going to this church, and I'm being drawn here to feel that prayerful consciousness, as William James calls it. Any way you can touch and physically in terms of place, I found that very meaningful. Otherwise, it would have been all a bit abstract if I weren't. And then it's happening to me at the same time.
For those interested, the Guild organizes several times a month a free walking pilgrimage of a lot of these sites in Lower Manhattan, so you can find out more. So, commercial interruption there for the Guild's walking pilgrimage. And so we have some great questions in the chat, and just wanted to say, Kate, yesterday there was a commencement mass, baccalaureate mass at my university, and the homily was precisely this: the priest mentioning the chaplain at Manhattan mentioning that when he was a student 50-something years ago up in Worcester, Dorothy came and he drove her around, and his life was changed by this brief encounter of driving her around. So I heard that in a homily yesterday. I hear this all the time. So there's some great questions in the chat. One is from Karen about how she often thinks about how Dorothy might react to the state of society at the present moment. If you added a chapter to your book that might think about how Dorothy's thoughts and actions responded to the challenges today, I'm sure that's a very brief question, but what we could say a lot. So what would you think? How might you take that next kind of prologue about why this is meaningful, what you wrote, to the moment today? So maybe start with DL, since I think you potentially were doing that very, yeah.
Oh dear. I just don't feel really totally qualified, but I will say, as someone who is a millennial and I'm, the parent of teenagers, I think Dorothy Day has a lot to say to young people right now who are feeling incredibly upset at the world they are inheriting and what has happened, even in the span of their own lifetime. And I think Dorothy, in her writings, she gives a lot of freedom to feel upset at our leaders, at the state of the world, how we are not taking care of our neighbors at the most basic levels possible. And so I think, when I think about the Catholic worker in particular, mutual aid, doing the works of mercy, these are all things that we need right now, and we're going to need more of, in the coming months and years. And so I feel like Dorothy just had a lot to say about being practical, working with people who are diverse and think differently from you, working together with people who all want to see the same common goals, which is, the poor and the marginalized in our society getting their basic needs and human rights met. So I think there's so much she would say. I don't exactly know the answer to this, but I think about, sometimes this is just a fun thought experiment. What would Dorothy think about social media? Would she view it as the new Catholic worker, like a place to put forth her ideas about how the world should be? I don't know. I feel like there's a lot there to kind of unpack, even about using our voices in this time of history. So Dorothy used her voice. She used her freedom of speech to say what she truly, truly believed in. And I don't know. I feel like there's a lot of people right now who are wondering what they should be doing with their own voice.
Thank you.
I asked somebody who knew her, what would she make of the Trump era now? Was just trying to remember who it was. It was either Jeff Knuths or Chaplin or Dan Mock, who worked on the newspaper, or Bill Griffin or Bob C. It was one of those four people who were very helpful with the book. And they just said to me, she'd seen worse. So she'd seen, why do we think this is any worse than 1940, than 1929, et cetera? She'd seen it all, and it's all bad on the national scene. So yeah, she'd know how to call it out now, but she'd seen it already.
Blythe or Kate?
Well, I think John is absolutely right. She had seen worse, but I do think she would be appalled at some of the meanness that is being exhibited in our leadership and by many people in this country. And people have forgotten Matthew 25, in my opinion. A lot of people have. And I think she would be very saddened by some of what we're seeing today.
I don't think she would be as angry today at the priests and ministers as she was in her own time, who don't call this out from the pulpit, who don't want to upset their parishioners, so they let it slide or are vague about this. This was always an issue. It's a common theme. Why are the priests and ministers not doing more? Throughout her life, that was a theme, and it's certainly true now. There's a great deal that they have to answer for.
Kate?
That's what I was going to add to, that she would be after those bishops like she was in her lifetime. She would definitely be after them. I just see that my sister just mentioned the nuclear threat. She was very, I mean, one thing that we forget that after Hiroshima, people were living with the expectation that the world was going to be destroyed from a nuclear holocaust. And so in that sense, she did understand that. I think she would be absolutely appalled with the immense buildup of the nuclear arsenal. And I think she would be absolutely heartbroken with climate change. I mean, she wrote a lot. She wasn't a nature writer, but she did have a very keen eye to the natural world. And I think that how she would ask us to respond to all of these questions, all of these problems, is that we have work to do, and we will always have work to do, and we just have to get on and figure out what is ours to do, to quote St. Francis, and to figure out what our strengths are and what we can do, take on personal responsibility and do what we can. There's always work to be done, she said.
And how many people were brave enough and on target enough in 1962 to say that Kennedy was as responsible as Khrushchev for the Cuban Missile Crisis? That it's not a matter of evil Russians and the good God-fearing Americans. That to me was very impressive to read. Reading every issue of the Catholic Worker from 1933 till her death. There's so many remarks like that and who would have the nerve now to say we're responsible for what's happening in Gaza, what's happening in Iran, Ukraine, et cetera. That she'd be saying it, that we're as responsible as the other side, but not too many others are.
Yeah, because I wonder, as a college student, how you see the relevance of all of this to your time, right? You're in this world. You're in the real world, despite what some people tell college students today. Like, how does this become relevant to your life?
Yeah, I think Dorothy Day has always been, for me, since I discovered her, she's been kind of like a second conscience. I think back to all of my values, but then I also try to ask myself, like I think many of you have mentioned, I do try to ask myself what she would say and what she would do about these things. And I think something that really sticks out to me about her is, I think it's really easy being a college student to sort of be part of that ivory tower where we read all these amazing things and we talk about them and we feel very good about ourselves for having a smart comment to say about something. But Dorothy didn't just read things and didn't just think about things. She let her life be changed by them. And I think that response is something that I try to emulate in my own life, even as a college student. And it's something that I'm trying to figure out as I enter the next chapter of my life and kind of go out into the world, is thinking, okay, you've just had this amazing education. Now, can you dare to be changed by it?
Great, thank you. There was a question in the chat about Thomas Merton and Dorothy's relationship, and that raised from someone who works at Gethsemane, and that raised the question about the another wonderful book that's out by Julie Peisior on Merton and Dorothy. We on the Greatest Commandment. So you can from Paulus Press, and the link to that is in the chat there. But I wonder if that also recalls us that when Pope Francis came to Congress, right, and he uplifted four great model Americans, and he talked about Thomas, he talked about Thomas Merton, Dorothy Day, Abraham Lincoln, and Martin Luther King Jr., right? What an interesting group of people. But I wonder if there is anything about Merton or others that anyone wanted to just quickly comment on.
That's one thing I have to say about that quartet. A person very highly placed in the hierarchy, whose judgment I trust totally, remarked that asking Pope Francis about those four, the Pope admitted that his knowledge of Dorothy Day, well, he's Argentinian, not American, but his knowledge of Dorothy Day was quite minimal when the speech was being prepared at the Vatican. So, and Samantha Powers, the ambassador sitting in Congress hearing that, said most of the Catholics in Congress didn't even know who she was. But then I'm surprised they knew who Merton was either. I mean, really, an inspirational figure also. Yeah.
It's an interesting quartet, but of course that has helped to encourage more energy in the Vatican, and both Pope Francis and Pope Leo have written forwards or will be publishing forwards to books published by the Vatican on this, so of Dorothy's works. So, but others on any of that relationship with either the Merton or others that might speak out to you.
The Berrigans.
Well, there hasn't yet, as far as I know, been a book about that relationship, but that might be a good book, a good next book to be out there. Dorothy and the Berrigans. I think it's in a lot of books, but that would be a great project to work on. So another question is, and we can come back to any of this, but I'm just conscious of the time. Dorothy has been significant for those interested in the Catholic worker, Catholic spirituality, and social teaching. And of course, many of us are eagerly awaiting a new encyclical by Pope Leo on AI and ethics, which is rumored to be coming soon. But have any of you thought about her understanding as how we can understand her as a significant American as part of the larger understanding how to live out democracy, not as an electoral system, but a way of life, right? I think a lot of activists are talking about the crisis of democracy right now, or the risks of authoritarian, as DL mentioned earlier. But Dorothy was an anarchist. So what does that mean to be in this 250th year of this country? What does her legacy say to us on that point?
I think that's where she's most out of a connection to mainstream America that believes in the two-party system and liberalism and progressive politics and so on. She's back with Jesus before any of this existed. So this is, to most Americans, maybe the hardest aspect of her to follow. The one other thing we have to remember, though, is with all this commitment to things that are difficult, when she'd go on those lecture tours, especially in the 50s after the Depression and so on, people would say, what are you glorifying poverty? You expect it's better to live with mice and cockroaches? And what about supporting my family? And her response would always be, everyone must find their own level of commitment to the cross. You don't have to live like me, the Catholic worker, but you must do something. You must find your own commitment to that kind of change. But I think Americans are quite resistant to that, even that idea, and it's least aggressive form.
I like to think, I always like to remember when people would say to her, well, even Christ said, the poor will always be with you. And she would say, yes, but he didn't say there had to be so many of them. And I loved that.
Yeah. DL, you were nodding your head before when John was speaking.
Yeah, I mean, it's just so, I think I was shocked trying to figure out what Dorothy thought about democracy. And I think it's kind of like she thought it was sort of a sham democracy that privileged the wealthy. And she was committed to doing something about it, though, on the grassroots level. And so it was really hard for me sometimes to want to grapple with how broken some of our political systems are. But she also had a lot of hope in people. And again, like being in a relationship with people who thought differently from her. When I went to her bedroom after I published my book, seeing all those books in her room with the plants and the quilts and everything, I thought this she knew how to live. She knew how to live in the tension of this system is fundamentally broken, and yet there's so many beautiful people here in it, and there's so much work to do today. And so I don't know. I think it is a little too much for a lot of Americans who still want to think that I don't know. She really to me spoke to this belief. I grew up with manifest destiny theology that God, specifically wanted all of this to go down in America. And I think Dorothy does a great job of saying, I don't think so. I don't think so. And I think we have a right to call out when it's broken and it's hurting people.
How telling that she was arrested as a suffragist in 1919 and never voted after women gained the right to vote. I mean, I think she would have agreed with Gore Vidal, who said there's only one party in America, the party of property, and it has two divisions, Democrat, Republican. That's her understanding.
Yeah. On Dale's point about the Manifest Destiny, there's a wonderful collection of essays on the centenary essays that was published by Marquette University Press on the centenary of Dorothy's birth. And that has an essay by Stephen Krupa, I think it is, on Dorothy and Manifest Destiny. There's a specific essay in there that's worth diving on that point. So there's another resource book there. I call it the Black Book, right? A big, thick essay collection of essays. Kate or Blythe, you want to just as a way to wrap up what Dorothy means today to the United States? Kate, living outside. Blythe, you're in the midst of Georgia.
I wish we were. I referenced earlier. I referenced Matthew 25. And I'm not the world's most devout person. As I said, I'm much more of a questioner than I probably should be. But I believe in Matthew 25. And I wish this country would get behind Matthew 25 and would do the things that that Christ asked his disciples to do. And I think this country would be so much stronger if we did.
Kate?
There are elements of Dorothy that don't really translate well, I think, to the times that we are in. The thing about her not voting, I once met a woman and she said, "Is it true that Dorothy never voted?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Well, I don't want to know anything about her." And she walked away. And it really struck me. My mother voted every single time. She was completely the opposite of her mother. But I think it is hard when there is an element of other, I hate using this word, but otherworldliness is not really right. It's more like my grandmother was always thinking outside of the box. And she's always thinking in terms of the long view. She really believed in the long view. She said the world's biggest failure is Christ, and she says we have to follow him. And so I think that's really hard for us now, for modern culture, to think with the long view, to think beyond party politics, to think beyond what we are facing, in the moment, and to think in a much beyond and deeper level. I think that's very, very hard to teach. It's very hard to understand. And I think, the way that I have learned from her or some of her, I think we have to find what she says that grounds us. She said in this, these things really struck me because you can get a very harsh view of her life, and you can view her as a very tough woman, which she was. She could be very harsh. She could be very difficult. Talk to my older sisters. They all, had their moments of confrontation with her. But there are some things that she said that have completely changed me. And I think that it's up to each of us to find those things. For example, I absolutely love her quote that she says, "You will know your vocation by the joy it brings you." It just opened up my life so much when I heard her say that. She also said that we have a responsibility to dream. We have an obligation to dream. And, I have crazy dreams. I have wild dreams. And I hear that voice. It's like, keep going. And I also hear her say, she said towards the end of her life, "I feel my life has been a failure." And I'm like, when I heard that, at first I was heartbroken. And then I thought, well, as she said, Christ is the world's biggest failure. And it's like, this is our obligation. If we're going to follow Christ, that's where we're going. It's Dan Berrigan said that we have to look good on wood if we're going to follow Christ, meaning that we're going to get crucified in one way or other. She doesn't ask anything easy. She asks so much of us on a very personal level. And I don't know if we're up to the task. I hope we are, but I don't know.
Well, what a challenging message, Kate, for us to end this with. We're in the season between Ascension and Pentecost as well, the long journey, this journey of from despair and frustration with the world to maybe some hope on the horizon. But all of you have shown what Kate was just pointing, that if you find joy in a vocation, it does show. And all of you have shown your joy as writers, and that I think certainly, and as a student, Cozette, and that certainly shines through in your writing and in your books. So on behalf of the Dorothy Day Guild and the Dorothy Day Center at Manhattan University, we are really grateful for your work, your contribution in this space. Thank you all for joining. If you've not had a chance to join or to get involved in the Dorothy Day Guild, feel free to get involved with us. We're also excited to welcome people on our walking tours and other webinars that we have. So thank you all, and go and find some good books to read and get that diary writing challenge up today. So thanks all today, and we'll be in touch. Thank you.